Let's turn it over to Jennifer Rexford.
So in my talk, I'm going to be giving an overview of a National Research Council study that was done on what happened to the internet during the 9/11 terrorist attacks, and to try to take from that some lessons for Hurricane Sandy. Now, what I'm going to try to do is three different things. I'm going to first give you a little bit of an overview of a timeline of what happened on 9/11. Slides are not moving forward. There they go. So first thing I'm going to do is give you a bit of an overview of the timeline of what happened on 9/11. The report goes into quite a bit of detail. It's actually one of the more interesting things in the report. It goes to a fair amount of detail about exactly what happened in the physical world and what the manifestations were for the internet at the same time. So I highly recommend taking a look at the report if you're interested in more detail. I'm going to give you a little overview of the timeline. Second thing I'm going to do is just give you a high-level overview of the findings our NRC report had. And then finally go through a few anecdotes that I think have some interesting implications for Hurricane Sandy as well. So just to give you a really brief overview of the timeline, the morning started out on 9/11 pretty normally, where there was a lot of maintenance activities during the late night and early morning, and traffic was just starting to increase with the beginning of the workday when everything started to happen. And so the first immediate manifestation was the destruction of a lot of equipment directly in the World Trade Center. But another big thing that happened was obviously a change in the way people were using the internet, and in particular, internet news sites were rapidly inundated with traffic just minutes after the attacks. We had a person that ran the CNN website during that time speak to our group, and he said by the time he saw the second plane hit the World Trade Center and the time he looked down to his computer, the servers were already completely overloaded, just in the few seconds it took him to look down at his computer. Immediately, New York City was without broadcast TV and radio. By mid-morning, when the towers actually collapsed, so when the World Trade Centers collapsed, we had a loss of a lot of infrastructure, including a transatlantic link. Internet traffic loads and connectivity briefly dropped after that. And at around 11 o'clock, we started to see peak demand in cell phone usage in New York City. Internet connectivity was sort of back to normal after recovering from some of the failures that happened in the earlier part of the morning. CNN.com had gradually gotten back to being able to handle demand, although demand was continuing to grow, doubling every 7 minutes. So during this period, so the amount of load on CNN was just profound. In the afternoon, part of the national 1-800 infrastructure failed due to high call volume. This ended up having implications for network operators not being able to communicate with each other as they tried to restore service. We started to see electrical problems in the afternoon, and one of the substations underneath World Trade Center 7 shut down, causing internet connectivity to dip again. When World Trade Center 7 collapsed, it caused physical damage to the Verizon facility on West Street, which caused a further reduction in connectivity. And then finally in the evening, the three remaining datacom centers in Lower Manhattan were struggling to keep operations going. Big problems with dust, getting into the air conditioners that were causing problems cooling the equipment. There was some operator error in dealing with backup generators, and difficulty of getting fuel trucks into Lower Manhattan because of restrictions on vehicle traffic in Lower Manhattan. And so backup generators over the next several days gradually ran out of fuel and weren't able to be refueled in a timely manner. And then finally in the evening, restoration of service was underway, but there are a number of places in both DC and in New York where there were no facilities available to actually feed network operators or to provide them places to sleep. And so there were a lot of difficulties just as people continued to bring the network infrastructure back up to fill those basic needs. And as I mentioned, there were continuing issues with fuel and with dust and air conditioners for electrical equipment in the days immediately after 9/11. So there were sort of sporadic internet outages for the first 3 or 4 days after 9/11 when backup generators ran out of fuel, were refueled, or where people made mistakes in restarting refueled generators. So the high-level findings of our report, the first one was at a high level, despite all the things I just mentioned, the internet was mostly fine outside of New York City. There was relatively little effect on overall internet services, and there was pretty considerable flexibility in rerouting around the failed infrastructure in New York. Another thing, and this relates to John's talk quite a bit, is that we actually had a very difficult time in our report doing a systematic study of what happened on 9/11 because there wasn't any really good data for us to use to study. So a lot of the things we did were anecdotal or using the very limited public data sets that were available. And an additional problem is people did collect data but didn't archive it. People that were collecting data for their network operations purposes didn't necessarily keep it for long periods of time. And we also lacked a really good sense of what a normal day on the internet looks like for a basis of comparison. The third finding was that there's really a major effect on certain internet services. Just as I mentioned earlier, CNN .com had a tremendous increase in load, a 2,500% increase in traffic demand. Cell phone peak usage in New York at 11 a.m. that morning also had a massive increase in demand. I'll come back to that point a little bit later in some of the anecdotes. Another thing is that the use of the internet wasn't typical. I sort of mentioned already that people were overloading the news sites. People were still using the telephone and television for primary access to information. This is probably a big difference during Hurricane Sandy because the prevalence of people that have only a cell phone or rely on the internet instead of having cable TV service is more prevalent now than it was 10 years ago. So for the most part, the internet was a backup for more conventional means of getting information. In other words, news websites being a backup for TV if it wasn't available, and instant messaging and voice over IP being a backup if the phone wasn't available. There was inadequate redundancy in certain places. ISPs have sort of financial incentives to co-locate their equipment, and so there were some co-location facilities that were damaged or destroyed during 9/11, which caused correlated outages for a number of carriers. But just to note, certain physical attacks that actually were targeting the internet, or particularly cyber attacks directly targeting the internet, could have had much more severe implications, because this really wasn't, in the end, an attack on the internet directly. There are a number of operational issues that merited attention. The reliance on 1-800 numbers. Network operators used 1-800 numbers to call one another, to coordinate activities, and because that shut down for part of the day, it made it difficult to coordinate. The internet and the public phone networks share fibers and conduits, so there were sort of correlated failures in the ability to use the telephone network and the internet. As I mentioned earlier, being able to feed and sleep for the operations staff was a challenge, and difficulties in managing fuel deliveries because internet infrastructure was not viewed as critical. The fuel trucks that were bringing fuel to the backup generators were not given priority access to Lower Manhattan, and so that caused problems as well. And I think a final lesson from our report was that not only should disaster plans plan for internet use, but that the internet actually in some ways has some nice properties that some of the other communications infrastructures lack. In particular, the ability to provide minimal connectivity to everyone rather than perfect connectivity to a few. And in particular, if it had been easier for people to do short text messages or very short phone calls, that might have been a good way to have leveraged the limited amount of cellular resources that were available, whereas the internet sort of just naturally gives a sort of fair share to different users. So I want to just end with a few quick anecdotes that I think are particularly interesting. The CNN website experience was particularly interesting. So as I mentioned a moment ago, the CNN website was inundated just moments after the second plane hit the World Trade Center. What they did is they basically went to an extremely low graphic image web page, and in fact actually edited the text on their homepage to fit in a single internet packet. So literally they were micro-editing words on a page so that every single request to the CNN website could be answered with one single data packet, plus the setup and teardown of the connection to the website. So that allowed a lot more people to get at least a limited amount of information relatively quickly. The second thing is that the Turner Network repurposed all of their servers, except for those hosting the Cartoon Network, so that children have something else to watch rather than what was happening. They essentially took all their other websites offline and made them replicas of the CNN website. So they essentially repurposed their computing infrastructure. And by the end of the afternoon on 9/11, they had employed Akamai to provide content distribution services to provide greater connectivity for their website. So just in a few short hours, they took several steps to make their content smaller, add more servers, and then outsource the hosting of their website to be able to get their content available to more people. So it's a pretty amazing story that just in a period of 6 hours, they were able to handle a several thousand% increase in demand that way. A second example is hidden dependencies. As you might imagine, most of the effects of 9/11 on the internet were localized to New York, but there are a few exceptions to that. One was the South Africa's top-level domain server went down because it was located in Manhattan and not replicated elsewhere. So intra-South Africa communication was almost completely disrupted because people could not look up any names in the .za domain. A second example is there was an ISP based in Florida that actually had its authentication servers in Manhattan, and so people in Florida that used that ISP also could not get connectivity that day. And finally, and this was particularly disconcerting, there were several hospitals in Manhattan that had wireless service for doctors to coordinate their rounds and access databases in the building, and some of them actually had a hidden dependency on access to their service provider outside of the building. So when their internet connectivity went down, they actually were unable to do intra-hospital communication as a result, which could have had very severe consequences had the hospitals been overwhelmed. And finally, this is kind of a sort of funny anecdote in the end. Overall, the amount of sort of churn in the routing on the internet on that day was lower than normal, despite all the things I just said. And the reason is actually that network operators, like everyone else, went home that day. And so planned maintenance activities and upgrades that would have normally taken place in the day actually were not performed. And ironically, they're actually responsible for a lot of the instability on the internet. And so as a result, the internet was ironically, in aggregate, more stable in the US than it would have been on a typical day. So just to conclude, the internet on 9/11 was relatively reliable, although some services clearly were badly affected, and most importantly, application usage shifted quite a lot. So the internet had to be sort of robust to handle that shift in demand. And I think a key takeaway here is that we need clearly better and more systematic measurement to more deeply understand what's actually happening, and better processes for uncovering these kind of hidden dependencies that people might have on shared infrastructure in a single location, and also to address these more human concerns about how to support operational staffs and disaster planning. Thanks.
Thank you very much.